do with an industrial relic? A 90-year-old grain silo that was the tallest building in South Africa when it was constructed in 1924. That was the challenge that I was tasked with back in 2010 when the area around the grain silo was identified for redevelopment. The silo building in question is in Cape Town at the foot of Africa in the old working harbour called the V&A Waterfront. And the silo building is ringed in the center there, and you can see it's right dead in the center of the waterfront. The waterfront is a 300-acre mixed-use development. It's got some of the most valuable real estate on the continent. And the grain silo building, again, you can see on the left with Table Mountain in the background. So quite a sort of, beautiful setting. Back in 2010, the grain silo building was a bit of a sight for sore eyes. It has fallen into a state of disrepair in 2000 when it was mothballed, and was kind of, situated in a dusty car park and surrounded by a small family of stray cats. So it was a bit of a challenging undertaking, and it had this really unfashionable magnolia yellow paint color going on, which kind of reminded us a bit of Granny's stockings, and we had to deal with that. And over the years, I mean, it was nearly 80 years of hard work the building had been through, and it had taken a terrific beating. And you can see the image on the left, the enormous pressures that grain silos have to endure during their working life. And this is one of the actual grain silos which had exploded after a plug of soybeans had dropped the 20 meters down, and the pneumatic pressures are so great it can bust 200 millimeter thick concrete. And there were very loud calls for its demolition. Obviously, it's an old building, valuable real estate, and it would be commercially much less risky to knock it down and build something new. But, why would you do that, really, was our response to the lobby groups that were pushing to knock it down. For us, the success of the waterfront is very much the mix of the old and the new. It was, I think, started in 1850, and there's multiple layers of history there. And there's a great contrast to the grittiness of the working harbour, the fishermen, and the dry docks, mixing with the German tourist with his Louis Vuitton handbag. And also just that cities evolve slowly and naturally, and the waterfronts also evolve slowly and naturally. And those layers of history are very, very important, I think, to creating a great space. And we didn't want to wipe the slate clean. And anyway, what would you replace it with that would have as much power as this fantastic image here? A commercial office building or a residential building, or maybe a really exciting new opera house. But we started to crawl around inside the silo building, and it was just some fantastic spaces in there, 8-meter high volumes, really cathedral-esque, exciting machinery, I mean, some really fascinating machinery, and great textures and a real soul, and it really resonated with us and spoke to us, and we started to fall in love with the building. And we started to do a bit more research into it. This is some images of the construction in the early 1920s. As I said, it was finished in 1924, and the storage annex, the 42 circular storage silo bins, were cast in one continuous slip form, setting a world record at the time for 6,300 cubic yards in about 2 weeks, which was quite an undertaking in the early 20s, I think. And then the story of why it was actually there. The story of the grain, the industrialization of the agriculture in South Africa, and the connection of the grain lands and the wheat lands of the interior by a new railway network down to the silos on the coast, and then exporting that out to the rest of the world. And that was a very powerful narrative for us, that taking the content and produce of Africa and exporting it out to the rest of the world. So we made the decision to make the silo building the hero, the cathedral in the square, if you will, of the new silo district. The new district would be about 1 million square feet of mixed-use development, and the silo building would be the moment in the center. And you can see, I think as all great projects start with a sketch on the back of a cigarette packet. This was the first sketch of what the silo district would start to look like. But it was an industrial building, and it's not really designed for human habitation. There was over 140 of these silo tubes, some circular, some square, some rectangle, and even between the circular tubes, there's these cruciform tubes, which they used to store grain as well. So as an adaptive reuse project, it was going to take a particularly different design approach to convert this into something usable, relevant, and hopefully beautiful. And we started to scan around the world to see who we could partner up with to attack this particular project. And we were struck by the work of a practice in London called Heatherwick Studio, and particularly their eclectic portfolio and the fact that they didn't focus on any particular typology or scale. And we decided we'd like to partner up with them, and thankfully they decided to partner up with us to try and find a way to unlock the potential of the building. So we had a series of workshops actually in 2011 to try and explore what this building could be programmatically. There was all sorts of exciting ideas like a mushroom farm and a space center. But at the very beginning of the project, when we made it that hero, we really wanted it to be an art museum. And I think every time we went through this iteration of what this could possibly be, it came back to a cultural facility for the public and an art museum. And that was set very much against the backdrop of what's going on in South Africa at the moment. It's in its 25th year of democracy. It's grappling with the legacies of apartheid. There's lots of huge amounts of social inequality, racial tensions. There's a history of violence in the place. And the government is really focused on the basics at the moment. It's about service delivery. It's about providing housing. It's about providing education. And there's very little headspace or even budget to invest in the arts and to invest in the culture. So if one of these museums, or if a museum is going to be built, it's going to require a new model. So we'd recognized the potential of the building. We'd recognized that the power and impact that art can have to society. And we recognized that we needed to create a platform for people to engage with the art, a safe space for people to go and engage with each other and be confronted potentially by issues that they can conveniently ignore on a daily basis. So at the Waterfront, we decided that the private sector needed to step up and fill the void left by the public sector, which was a huge leap into the unknown for a company that's used to doing shopping centers and luxury hotels. And we'd have to create a new model for this. There was no working model for Africa. There's very few museums in Africa. And we'd have to create a relevant model for the continent. In Europe, I mean, predominantly funded by government. In America, there's a huge philanthropic culture. But in Africa, there is no government funding. There is no philanthropic culture. There's no tax breaks for anyone to give money to these sorts of developments. So we had to come up with a new model that would keep costs low. We'd have to find a collection that would also keep costs low. And we'd have to find a way to cross-subsidize in some way with another use, potentially a hotel. So we had to create this public institution with this new business model, but we needed to find a collection. And serendipity would have it that Jochen Zeitz, the ex-CEO of Puma, had also been come up with the idea to create a museum on the African continent focusing on contemporary African art. And he'd been collecting art for the last 8 years with that very purpose. So we partnered with him to create what is now known as the Zeitz Museum of Contemporary Art Africa, with an ambition to create the largest museum to be built on the African continent for over 100 years. So we created the institution, which is no easy thing, but we also had to create the building, which was equally challenging. So I'll hand over to Matt, who can take you through that.
Thanks, Mark. When we first travelled to Cape Town, we spent some time just walking the city, speaking to people on the street about their kind of knowledge and understanding of the building. And we were struck by that everyone knew what it was, everyone knew where it was, everyone was curious about it, interested in it. And we felt quite a responsibility, as well as kind of architects for the building, but also to think about its use and how the architecture and its use stitches together. The building was actually two buildings. The rectilinear form on the left-hand side was the elevator tower, which is that geometry because it housed a lot of the machinery for the machine. And on the right-hand side is the storage annex, which were tubular in nature due to their structural efficiency. The building was also two buildings shown here as well, both horizontally. So the yellow area was where the grain was stored, and that was a series of kind of tubes that Mark alluded to. And the red area above was where all the machinery was kept, which was formed in steelwork, encased in concrete, and had much larger spans. It was also quite interesting as to how the workers moved up within the building. They used to slide down on firemen's poles or be pulled up on leather straps, moving constantly up and down the building. Quite an exciting kind of theatre of movement. We couldn't replicate exactly that on the final building, but it inspired us to think about how might you move vertically through this building. When you're working in with an existing building, it's always an engaged conversation. Its historic programmatic uses and structure heavily informed how we thought about kind of approaching the building to create the institution that Mark spoke about. The tightly controlled spaces at the lower level, we chose to form the kind of galleries within there, about 100 square foot of galleries, dropped in a series of new levels. And then on the upper area, where the floor plates were much wider and the slab and the kind of the spans much greater, we placed some of the kind of exhibition spaces, the bigger exhibition spaces, the kind of the cafes, the restaurants, but also the 29-key boutique hotel, which helps to cross-subsidize the institution below. The existing building had such kind of industrial kind of grandeur, a kind of a pattern of age that had been built up over nearly 100 years. The intervention, we felt, must work with that. It cannot just ignore it or do something destructive to it. It has to kind of play with the building in some way. And we decided to be very clear with what was new and what was existing, so we don't kind of muddle that. We need to show the layers very clearly. So much like Venetian glass-blowing technique here, where they use chicken wire to begin to distort and change the glass as it's blown into it, we decided to use the existing structural grid of the building to distort the new windows and the new kind of glass areas we're putting in at the upper level. So conceptually, as if the pressure of the grain had got too much for the building, it began to pillow out and push it out. And this is an image of one of the earlier mock-ups of the new windows. The kind of the precision of the glasswork and the precision of the frame is in stark counterpoint to the roughness of the original facade. The geometry of the faceted panels was much cheaper to produce than a kind of curved glass form, but it also plays some interesting things with reflections. So when you're walking around the building, you occasionally get views of the sea, the sky, or even yourself as the light shifts and reflects on these panels. The geometry also allows the windows to partially self-shade. Cape Town is a very hot climate in the summer, so we need to think quite coherently about solar shading and thermal gain. The pillars are very high performance, soft-coated, double-glazed units, and they were manufactured by a local company. This wasn't a Japanese or a German company that would import into South Africa. This is a local Cape Townian company. So we managed to keep the costs very low and also kind of prevent costs such as shipping and things. From inside the building, the rooms also kind of had some of this strong geometry which began to frame the views out. Cape Town is a very beautiful city, and you alternatively frame views of Lion's Head, of Table Mountain, or of the sea and the sky. So the building, due to its heritage status, was always going to be the tallest building in the V&A waterfront. And it's viewed from every direction. So at night, the facade transforms, creates a lantern back to Cape Town as a kind of signifier of its repurposing, an invitation back to the waterfront for Cape Townians. At the lower floors, a different approach was needed, the tight concrete tubes that were inhabiting there. So we knew we needed to cut these tubes back to create areas for the galleries. And we started experimenting with different ways of doing that. And we were struck that when you started to cut through with a curved plane, you created quite dramatic geometries. This kind of deconstruction also revealed the original geometries of the building. So we knew we needed to create a heart to the institution, to give logic to the deep floor plates, and to something to help organize the galleries around. Visiting museums in South Africa is perceived as white and elitist. We needed a way to encourage participation. We didn't want to create an architecture that you would simply Instagram and then go home. It needed to lure you in. We asked our client, much to their kind of confusion, to courier us some grain from the original grain silo. And we took some of that grain and supersized it up, and then used that as a cutting tool to then create a heart to the building. So you can see the central atrium stitches the two building sides together. Much like a kind of cut section through an ant farm, you begin to see how the building used to operate. From a sustainability perspective, we retained a high percentage of the existing building, including all the substructure. And we retained all its inherent thermal mass to manage the high summer temperatures in Cape Town. The atrium creates a stack effect where it is drawn in at the base through the basement areas and then ejected at high level. Where high levels of performance and humidity control were required, for example, within the galleries, we took advantage of its location to use seawater cooling to reject that excess heat. Now, the existing bins were nearly 100 years old, and both very, very strong, but very, very weak in sections. So we had to re-sleeve the internal areas, both for water ingress and also about thermal performance. In terms of forming the main atrium, that also acted as a structural arch that then moved the loads down to the edges of the building. We considered quite sophisticated technologies to create the overall geometry that we're trying to achieve, kind of CNC, polystyrene formwork, point clouds, all of that rather sophisticated computer stuff. But when we actually got to the building and we started surveying it, it was incredibly eclectic. It was moving both horizontally and vertically, deviations of about 150 millimeters vertically. And that really made the imprecision of the bins kind of made that kind of technology redundant. So we had to go back to quite old school surveying techniques and setting out technologies, working with a subcontractor. The major challenge lay in actually cutting through the bins. We used extensive testing of different methods of doing that, such as stitch drilling and my personal favorite, the thermic lance, which unfortunately didn't work, but it looked kind of amazing. See that cut through concrete. With 9 months of experimentation, we ended up a solution of using diamond wire, but also handheld circular saws to create the deep cuts without putting undue stress on the original concrete, which can shatter quite easily. The creation of the atrium actually became a major piece of craft. We worked closely with a subcontractor, just running your hand over the smoothness of that, and then carving it back, and feeling for the geometry. All of that from a suspended scaffold above the atrium floor, which is quite exciting for anyone that suffers from vertigo, but it was quite an exciting process working with the subcontractors and forming that space. So the creation of the atrium took just over a year, many meetings and discussions to get to trying to make it look effortless, but it was quite far from being effortless. We also were very clear where the new concrete had put in. You can see from the image here the darker new concrete, re-sleeving the warmer, more exposed aggregate of the original concrete. Just being very clear and articulating the difference between the new intervention and the existing building. So the final atrium appears effortless, like a hot knife cutting through butter, linking the two buildings together. We also created openings in the roof with a walkable skylight, which then flooded the main area with light, with additional openings at each gallery floor so you could legibly understand where you were in the building. The galleries themselves were conceived as very, very simple white boxes, conceptually dropped within the tubes. There were new modern inserts. The vertical circulation here, you can see the cylindrical lifts that run up within the tubes and a corkscrew spiral staircase to link the floors together. As people appeared and disappeared within the tubes themselves, they began to animate the space and encourage you to explore the building further. The inside the galleries, the high levels of temperature humidity control were very, very precise, but the spaces themselves were very, very simple because we knew they were going to be appropriated by the artists over time. We needed to make them inherently flexible to do that. Really, the architecture was just a platform for this appropriation by the artists. The carve continues into the basement, revealing the tunnels below. Again, the building encourages exploration, to discover the history of the building and kind of discover the art as you move through it. We also took advantage of some of the bins within the basement area for soundscapes and projection. The process on the outside of the building is more akin to a kind of an archaeology. As Mark alluded to, the building had originally been concrete, and then it was rendered, and a lovely magnolia paint was applied to the outside. We kind of stripped all that kind of makeup away from the building to reveal the original concrete, which had an incredibly warm matrix, and the aggregate, which was sourced from Table Mountain, had a kind of vivid blue tone to it. It was very, very beautiful. So we stripped that away and kind of let that warmth and richness come through. And it felt like it was carved from rock, like kind of Petra, that the building has kind of always been there, that solidity. And all the scrapes and repairs and 90 years of kind of use were just exposed and gave it a greater beauty. There was no need for perfection here. That kind of natural variation did it for you. The existing lightweight structures we reutilized. These are the track sheds at the lower end of the building, which then becomes kind of lightweight portcullis shares that lead you from the new silo square, which created around 200,000 square foot of new public realm for the entire district. The building sits right in the center of the square, with cafes, restaurants, and hotels surrounding it to activate the public realm. But also the space around it acts as an extension of the institution. There's a rotating series of artworks and performances in that space, to expand the institution beyond the confines of the building itself. This project has always been about creating an educational platform, a vessel for the diverse communities of Cape Town to reclaim the waterfront for their own. Give a compelling physical and visual incentive to engage in the art of the continent.
I see we've got time's up, but short video. The museum opened in September 2017 with artists such as William Kentridge, Kehinde Wiley, Lisa Liu, Chris Feely, Mary Sabande, and Ellen Atsui. We originally estimated that we'd get about 200,000 visitors in the first year, and we're on track to double that, which we're quite excited about. And just in terms of the costs, we managed to achieve all of this within a budget of about $35 million US. We hope this building proves that although it's complex and challenging, it's possible that the private sector can take the lead in cultural provision that has the potential to drive positive social change with a modest budget and act as a new model for the funding and support of the arts. Thank you very much.